Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for sticking to the time, first of all. Now we would like to announce another very strong name from the academia. His main areas of expertise are airline marketing and economics, as well as air cargo. We would like to welcome Dr. Robert Mayer, the course director of Air Transport Management Program at Cranfield University, UK.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. The reason why I don't stand behind there is I washed my trousers, I ironed them, so I want you to see them, because otherwise it would be a shame of all the time that I spent on my trousers. When I was asked to talk about air transport or airline strategies in Turkey, I said, yeah, sure, I can do that. And the next thing I thought, well, I know a lot about airlines, I don't know that much about Turkey. So I started researching and I started looking at Turkish Airlines. And everyone talks about Atatürk Airport and the new airport. And when I looked at kind of hub strategies, actually, Turkish Airlines does not only fly from Atatürk, they also fly from Sabiha Gökçen. Is that correct? Thank you. So it's actually not a tale of one airport, it's a tale of two airports. So and that reminded me of Charles Dickens' novel, A Tale of Two Cities. I don't know if you've read it, but it compared basically England and France during the French Revolution. I'm not going to start a revolution today, but I'm trying to compare and contrast different airports. So the first question is, what is this presentation about? Well, we can see not only Turkish Airlines, but there are a lot of airlines that operate from one city, but two airports. And I'm not talking about kind of airlines that have several hubs in different cities. So if you think, for example, of Lufthansa, they have a hub in Frankfurt and in Munich, two different cities. Here I'm talking today about one city, but two airports. And a lot of airlines take advantage of that. So if we take, for example, British Airways, they operate from Heathrow and Gatwick. That's their hub. But they also operate to destinations that have several airports. So if you think of New York, there's New York John F. Kennedy and New York, Newark, which is in New Jersey. So basically, airlines do fly from a lot of different airports in the same city. So we'll try to find out, well, why do airlines do that? And also, what different strategies do different airlines follow when they do that? Now, the first reason, probably the most obvious reason, and we see that in Istanbul as well, why airlines do that, is because there are capacity constraints. Probably the airlines would like to fly from one airport, but they have to duplicate their hubs because there's not enough space. And that's the same in Istanbul, but also in London Heathrow. So airlines find it very difficult to grow at these airports. The only way how they can grow really is either to find another airport or use larger aircraft, and that has happened in some cases. If you look at the graph on the right-hand side, the top line is London Heathrow, and that's the average size of aircraft at London Heathrow. So you can see by looking at these different European hubs, Heathrow is by far the largest average aircraft size. If you look at the second one, I don't know if you can read that, that's that yellow line, the red line here, and that has been growing and growing. And that's Istanbul Atatürk. So we saw that Turkish Airlines, basically to take advantage of of the situation that they're in, they chose to increase the average aircraft size to grow at Atatürk, at the same time while still operating from the other airport as well. Another reason why airlines might operate from two hubs in the same city relates to bilateral agreements and legal aspects. And I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not even trying to even comment on that. But we've seen in the past that bilateral agreements have affected airlines' choices of from which airport they fly from as well. Nowadays, we see more and more open skies agreements, so probably this will become less and less important. So these are basically the reasons why airlines have to choose a second hub in a city. But there are also kind of economic reasons why they probably want to do that. If we look at kind of cities and the different airports that operate, that are available in those cities, sometimes these airports are fairly far apart from each other. I've got some examples here. So for example, London Gatwick and Stansted are 87 kilometers away from each other. And that's as the crow flies, so great circle distance, not if you drive it. If I go to somewhere in the middle, you've got Atatürk and Sabiha Gökçen. They're still 43 kilometers apart by air. Now, if you drive that, I have no idea, how long does that take? 5 hours. So you can see already here, if you have to drive for several hours to get from one airport to the other, probably there are opportunities there for the airlines to probably duplicate their services. At the bottom, you see JFK and Newark Airport. Now, they are only 27 kilometers apart as the crow flies. But if you look at the map at the bottom, if you actually drive it, it's 53 kilometers. And in fairly good traffic, that takes 50 minutes. So in other words, probably the distance from the different airport opened up new opportunities as well. And I can show that in the next graph, where you can see the catchment areas for different airports. I don't know if you can see that, but basically the green areas are where passengers travel from to a particular airport. On the top left, that's Heathrow. We've got Stansted, Luton, and Gatwick. And you can see the green areas move. So in other words, the catchment area for different hubs and different airports are different, even in the same city. So that's an opportunity for airlines to kind of attract passengers to a particular airport. Now in my example, I take you on a journey around the globe. So we're starting with Istanbul, going to Paris and looking at Air France, London and looking at British Airways, then New York with Delta, and finally we end up in Japan and looking at the airports in Tokyo and Japan Airlines. So I'll just give you a brief overview about these different airlines and how they deal with their hubs in these cities. Now, I was really afraid that Dr. KOTIL might give you a different number, and he did. So he said, I think Turkish Airlines flies to 288 destinations. I took the data also from OAG, and I looked at 1 week in March last month. So therefore, there could be small issues. The key issue, though, is Turkish Airlines flies to a lot of destinations. And if you look at some of the other hubs later, you'll see that this is actually quite a big number. And from Atatürk, you can basically reach the whole world, as we saw this morning. They've got a global network, but also they've got a domestic network. If we look at Turkish Airlines at Sabiha Gökçen, they fly to only 53 destinations. And interesting, 51 of these 53 destinations are also served from Istanbul by Turkish Airlines. So they basically duplicate their service. Only 2 destinations in that week that I looked at were not served from Istanbul, and that's Tokat and Uzak. And I had no idea where it was, but I looked it up on the map now, so I know it's somewhere in fairly central Turkey. So if you look at the strategy here, it's really about duplicating the service rather than complementing each other. If we look at Air France, from Charles de Gaulle, their main hub, they fly to 137 destinations. If you compare that to the previously over 240, so quite a difference in the size of network. From their second airport, Orly, they only fly to 24 destinations. And when it comes to the network, Charles de Gaulle has a global and regional, and what I mean by regional is European network. Well, from Orly, they actually only serve domestic routes. Now, France also has so-called départements d'outre-mer, which is basically overseas territories, which are quite far away. So they do operate long-haul flights also from Orly, but it's mainly domestic. Well, it's domestic, including some long-haul domestic flights. And 11 destinations are served from both airports. So if we compare that, for example, with Turkish Airlines, where basically all destinations were served from the second airport, in the case of Air France, this is not the case. Moving on to London. Now, I included also London City here, and actually last month or so, British Airways announced that from this summer they will also operate some flights from London Stansted, but I just stuck with these 3 for the moment. Heathrow, they serve 125 destinations, again, global network, as you would expect, including 7 domestic destinations from Heathrow. 46 destinations from Gatwick, and they are mainly leisure destinations as well as some domestic routes. And then from London City, it's mainly business and leisure destinations. And you can see, for example, with regards to duplication, London Heathrow and London City, it's 7 destinations that they have in common. Heathrow and Gatwick have got 11. Gatwick and London City, 1, that's Malaga, and then there are 5 destinations that's served by all 3 airports. Again, slightly different to what we've seen with Air France, particularly in the sense that Gatwick is not a domestic airport, it's about leisure travel. If we move on to North America, New York. We've got Delta flying from JFK, LaGuardia, and Newark. And they have got 83 destinations from JFK, again with a global network. They've got 56 destinations from LaGuardia, and they are basically all domestic destinations. Now, some of you might say, Yule is not domestic. Does anyone know where Yule is? Yeah. Montreal, YUL is Montreal. But there are actually American immigration available in Montreal. So when the aircraft arrives in LaGuardia, it's like a domestic flight. And LaGuardia can only handle domestic flights. And then we've got New York with 7 destinations. Again, you can see there's some overlap between the airports, but again, different to what British Airways did with their leisure destinations and their global network. And finally, in Tokyo, we've got Japan Airlines that operates from Haneda and Narita. Haneda has got a very, very strong domestic network, so you will find a lot of domestic flights from Haneda. In total, they operate 46 destinations there. Narita only 34, but a much more global network. So it's quite an interesting case that the more internationally and long-haul focused airport, with regards to the number of destinations, is actually the smaller one. And there are 11 destinations served from both airports. Now, so far, I've only looked at the number of destinations. I haven't looked at the number of seats. And if we look at the seat share between the two airports for all these different airlines, you can see that, particularly in the case of British Airways, Turkish, and Japan, one airport really dominates. So the majority of the seats are at one airport, while the other airport has got a very small seat share. With regards to Air France, you can see already that Orly's share is slightly higher, and that is mainly because of the strong domestic network that they operate. And in the case of Delta, very interesting, it's more or less half and half. So while the number of destinations from JFK were much higher, if you just look at kind of the seat share, you can notice there's hardly any difference between the two airports. Try to freeze this picture in your mind for a moment, because if we look at it from a different perspective, and that is kind of share of domestic seats and share of international seats, you can see actually quite a few differences. So if we start off with Turkish Airlines on the left, so if we just look at domestic flights from both Istanbul airports, excluding international ones, you can see that the share of Sabiha Gökçen is much higher than the overall seat share, while on international routes is much smaller. And we see similar things also in some of the other airports. So if you look at, for example, British Airways, Gatwick has a higher share of domestic seats in comparison to their overall seat share. Interesting enough, Air France, because Orly is so much focused on domestic flights, you can really see that also in the seat share. Well, with Delta, you would expect LaGuardia to have a higher domestic share, mainly because they only do domestic flights. And interesting enough, if you look at Japan Airlines, we said actually Haneda is the larger airport, but when it comes to domestic share, they really dominate the market. When it comes to international share, actually Narita has got a much higher share than Haneda. So you can see different airlines, different strategies when they operate two hubs. Interesting enough, what you will also see across all airlines, the aircraft size at the bigger airport is also bigger. So in other words, the airlines operate larger aircraft from their bigger airport. And you can see Turkish Airlines, Japan Airlines, and Air France are fairly similar. So it's about 8% larger aircraft measured by seats. If you look at Delta, actually JFK much larger, mainly because they operate international flights in wide bodies. If we look at frequency from the two airports, so how often an airline flies to a destination from that particular hub, you can see in the case of Turkish Airlines, not much difference actually between Atatürk and Sabiha Gökçen. So they basically fly around 10, 11, 12 times a week to a destination. If you look at Air France, huge difference. So you can see the average frequency from Orly is much higher. And you probably would expect that because of the strong focus on the domestic network. British Airways, slightly higher than at Gatwick, while in New York, you can see Delta has got a higher frequency from LaGuardia, again, because of the domestic flights. And the same is also true for Japan Airlines in Tokyo, where the domestic airport has got a much higher frequency than the more internationally focused airport. So, some preliminary conclusions. First of all, we see that some airlines operate unique networks from this airport, some see more overlap. So if we look at the overlap for Turkish, well, the more unique network for British Airways. Some see some form of specialization. Now that could be the leisure market, it could be domestic routes, or it could be business routes in the case of London City. And we also see that the airlines have got different strategies when it comes to the average frequency between the two airports. There are also some commonalities between all the 5 airlines that we looked at. So we saw that the seat share is usually higher at one airport than at the other, with the exception of Delta. We saw that usually domestic share is higher at one airport than at the other, with the exception of Japan Airlines. And generally at the larger hub, aircraft size is large as well. Now, some of you say, yeah, that's all great, but what about low-cost airlines? Because apparently low-cost airlines are fairly big nowadays. And what do they do? Well, first of all, we don't really talk about hubs when it comes to low-cost airlines because they don't offer usually hub and spoke systems. So we talk more about bases. They offer limited long haul, although in the US they sometimes offer transcontinental, which is fairly long haul. And we've seen some airlines are moving into the long haul market. And usually their geographic reach is much smaller. So just a quick overview what kind of the low-cost airlines are doing. And as an example, basically I tried to find cities where low-cost airline operate from several airports, and that wasn't that easy. I even looked at Pegasus, and I think they've got one flight from Izmir to Atatürk, and that's it. So I didn't include them in my presentation, I'm afraid. Oh, 5 daily, but only one destination. So basically I looked at New York and JetBlue, so they've got a base at JFK, and they fly to LaGuardia in New York, but they actually don't base aircraft there. But I included them in my sample because otherwise I would only talk about London. In London, we've got Ryanair. They fly to Stansted, Luton, and Gatwick, and EasyJet flies to Gatwick, Luton, and Stansted. They also operate from Southend, but it's a fairly small airport, so I thought I'll skip that. Right, so if we look at JetBlue, we had 67 destinations from JFK, 8 destinations from Newark, and 6 from LaGuardia. As we already know, LaGuardia is only a domestic airport. But you can see also in Newark, most of the airports that are served from Newark are basically in the US, particularly in Florida. So you can see particularly LaGuardia and Newark focused on traffic to Florida, while at JFK they've got a much wider network. And there's some overlap between the destinations, particularly obviously between Newark and JFK and LaGuardia and JFK. So basically all flights from the 2 other airports are also served from JFK. In the case of Ryanair, they offer 119 destinations from Stansted, 17 from Luton, 5 from Gatwick. So you can see again quite a big difference. There's one airport that's fairly strong, while the other ones are much smaller. And some destinations are served from either all 3 or one of the 2. And then we've got EasyJet with 79 destinations from Gatwick, 39 from Luton, and 18 from Stansted. Again, some overlap between the larger one and the other 2. Although we see here they also offer some unique destinations that are not served by any of the other 2 airports. Now, if we look at kind of the focus of the low-cost airlines with regards to their airports, you can see that Ryanair really has a very, very strong dominance in Stansted, while the other 2 airports are fairly small when it comes to weekly seat share. Well, JetBlue, JFK obviously dominates, but the others are a bit bigger. And then if we look at EasyJet, actually they spread their seat share across a much wider range of different airports. So although Gatwick still dominates, it's not as strong as in the case of Stansted for Ryanair. I also looked at frequency, and that's quite interesting. So you can see quite a big difference between the North American low-cost carrier and the 2 European low-cost carriers, where you can see that average frequency from a particular airport is much higher for JetBlue than the other 2 airlines. So it's much smaller there. And the interesting thing is, a lot of people, when they talk about Ryanair, they say, actually, their frequency is fairly low. If we compare it for the London airports, actually, you can see there's hardly any difference between EasyJet and Ryanair. And the interesting thing is both low-cost airlines have a much higher frequency at Gatwick than at the other two airports. So there's probably something special about Gatwick when they chose that as a base, and probably the demographic and the type of people who travel from there are different. So some more conclusion. So we saw that there are some differences in the frequencies, with JetBlue offering higher frequency at all of their airports in comparison to EasyJet and Ryanair. We see that some airlines, particularly Ryanair and JetBlue, focus on one airport in that city rather than spreading their routes across all three airports. Well, EasyJet spreads it a bit more. There are very few unique routes, so there's much more duplication with regards to the destination served, so similar to what we've seen with Turkish Airlines in Istanbul. But the frequencies do vary, and we see that Gatwick has got the higher frequencies, while Stansted and Luton have got smaller frequencies. Overall, so what's my tale of two airports about? Well, we can see that different airlines operate different strategies. They all have got some things in common, particularly if you look at British Airways and Turkish Airlines. They've got a problem that they can't grow at their current airport. So we'll see what the new airport will bring, particularly if I go to the last point. Well, how will airlines use Sabiha Gökçen once the new airport is open? Because at the moment, there's a push probably away from the congested airports. But we can see that in some cases, actually, operating from two airports can really increase your catchment area and attract new passengers. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion in the roundtable that we'll have later. But do you have any questions for me at the moment?
First of all, thank you for the great presentation and great the data from the different sources. I just would like to add something about Istanbul and the Sabiha Gökçen Airport, and this is, I think, unique in terms of these two airports is definitely two different catchment areas. And also, I think Turkish Airlines has a significantly competitive advantages in their hub because they don't have any headache, as we said, low-cost carriers in their Istanbul hub. This is another reason. And my question is, do you think that is there any ideal fleet size in terms of to create a hub and spoke in a different airport in a city without harming your real base?
Okay, so I mean, probably coming to the first point, obviously you're absolutely right. Based on the geographic location, you've got an advantage in the sense that you've got two separate catchment areas, and also Turkish Airlines has got the advantage that local airlines probably will find very difficult to fly into Atatürk, and it's probably very similar to what BA finds in Heathrow as well. Coming to your question of the ideal size. Now, if we probably look at the low-cost airlines, Ryanair has got bases where they've got only 2 or 3 aircraft based. So this will work for point-to-point traffic. So if your strategy from the second airport is to mainly focus on point-to-point traffic, the number of aircraft at that airport is probably not so important. If you really want to operate a hub-and-spoke network from the second airport, then you need to have significant size, because otherwise you can't offer the transfer connections. So you probably would look at probably smaller network airlines in Europe that operate a hub-and-spoke system with not 300 aircraft, but probably 50, 60 aircraft. So it depends on what your strategy for the second airport is.
Okay.
Thank you for your presentation. What about the effect of connectivity between two airports at the same city? Also, it is another important factor, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at kind of how the two airports are connected, it's quite important. Now, in one of my earlier slides, I looked at kind of the distance, and I don't think any airport or any city has really managed to connect two airports fairly in a good way that is attractive for passengers. I know in London there's been a lot of talks about linking Gatwick and Heathrow, and one thing that people in the UK like is talking about airports, but if you look at the third runway for Heathrow, there's been talk about a third runway for many, many years, and nothing has happened. So I think it would be a fantastic idea to link two airports, for example, by high-speed rail, and then kind of offering a better network. I'm still waiting for a very good example to tell you that's really happening.
Third airport, new airport in Istanbul.
Oh,
Most
Another
Thank you.